Good morning and welcome to the 8th meeting in 2026 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. We have 3 pieces of subordinate legislation to consider today, and I intend to allow around 30 minutes for this part of the meeting. We will begin with an evidence session with the Minister for Public Finance on the Scottish Aggregates Tax Miscellaneous Amendment Regulations 2026 draft. The Minister is joined today by Scottish Government officials: Jonathan Waite, Aggregates Tax Bill Team Leader; Cara Wood, Senior Policy Advisor, Aggregates and Landfill Taxes; and Emma Phillips, Lawyer, Scottish Government Legal Directorate. So I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the meeting and invite the Minister to make a short opening statement. Good morning, Minister.
Good morning, and thank you, Convener. The Scottish Government is working closely with UK Government, HMRC and Revenue Scotland to ensure the successful introduction of the Scottish Aggregates Tax. This has included productive engagement on cross-border legislation to ensure that the administration arrangements for the Scottish Aggregates Tax and the UK Aggregates Levy work together effectively. The 3 SSIs that are under consideration by the Committee today make provisions that are required to ensure the practical operation of Scottish Aggregates Tax, which the Scottish Government remain on track to deliver on 1st April 2026. The Scottish Aggregates Tax Miscellaneous Amendment Regulations 2026 cover the tax treatment of aggregate that is collected and transported across the border and complex multi-stage supply chains involving intermediaries. These are a type of indirect supply where a business acts as an intermediary between the aggregate producer and the end user of aggregate, for example, a builder's merchant. These regulations provide taxpayers with clarity on the operation of Scottish Aggregates Tax. They are intended to prevent double taxation, minimise market distortion and support a smooth transition from UK Aggregates Levy to the Scottish Aggregates Tax. The approach taken follows detailed and close collaboration with Revenue Scotland, HMRC and industry stakeholders, including through our expert advisory group. That engagement both preceded a public consultation held in June last year on proposed approaches and continued following its closure to ensure that all relevant cross-border scenarios have been considered. Following engagement with HMRC, complementary amendments to UK Aggregates Levy legislation are being made through the Finance No. 2 Bill to ensure that the 2 taxes dovetail. The SSIs under consideration today also include the Revenue Scotland and Taxpayers Act Involved Third Parties Amendment Order 2026, which makes provisions which enable the inspection of the business premises of involved third parties for the purposes of the tax. In addition, the Revenue Scotland and Taxpayers Act Interest on Unpaid Tax and Interest Rates in General Amendment Regulations 2026 provide that interest on an amount of unpaid Scottish aggregate tax is due from the filing date of the tax return for the purposes of the tax. The changes made by these 2 SSIs made under the Revenue Scotland and Taxpayers Act, which were consulted on as part of the Scottish Aggregates Tax Administration Regulations public consultation, will ensure that Scottish Aggregates Tax is operationally effective in line with the wider legislative regime for the devolved taxes. Overall, the 3 instruments intend to support the effective and efficient administration of Scottish Aggregates Tax by Revenue Scotland. In particular, introducing secondary legislation that makes provision in relation to certain cross-border movement of aggregate will enable taxpayers to understand the tax treatment of these movements under the new Scottish Aggregates Tax regime. And I'm happy to take questions, Convener.
Thank you. Liz?
I'm generally very happy with this, Minister. Just one question. You intimated that local government doesn't really have any impact on local government, but obviously we have 4 local authorities that have their own quarries and therefore they're dealing with it a separate way. At the time, did any of the local government offices show any signs of concern about this at all?
Not that I'm aware of, but I'll ask officials if there's any feedback on that.
Not as part of the consultation analysis. I think the scenarios that we're looking at in terms of cross-border movement are ones that originate in the rest of the UK coming into Scotland. So we've been engaged with COSLA throughout the process, but in this circumstance they didn't highlight any issues.
Okay, thank you.
John?
Thank you. Yes, just one point on the involved third-party order. Could you give us an example of kind of the scenario that this might impact on? Who would an involved third party be and why would we want to?
Well, I'll ask officials to go into some of the detail on that, but in general it's about the point at which the tax is levied or becomes due, which would typically be if it's quarried in Scotland, or it's where it's used. So it's quarried in Scotland and used in Scotland. It's payable in Scotland, but in scenarios where it's moving cross-border in either direction, the point at which the quarry would sell it on to the intermediary is where the liability would arise. And obviously there'll be various scenarios within that. And it was important that we used these regulations to make sure that all those scenarios were considered, so there weren't any loopholes, if you like.
Entering the business premises of an involved third party. So why would anyone want to do that? Just to check that?
Oh, in terms of the that provision, yeah, absolutely, to be able to check what's in a case where you've got questions or Revenue Scotland wanted to verify what was happening with regards to the movement, then that they would have the power to be able to, as you would expect.
So as well as in checking on the quarry itself,
yeah.
They would be able to check on other organisations that took the material. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything else on that? Is that
That's fine.
cover it?
I'm okay with that. Yep.
Nobody's saying I'm wrong, so it must be right.
Okay, we appear to have no further questions, so I'd like to turn to agenda item 2, which involves formal consideration of the motion on the instrument. I invite the Minister to speak to and move S6M 20639.
Moved.
The Finance and Public Administration Committee recommends that the Scottish Aggregates Tax Miscellaneous Amendment Regulations 2026 draft be approved. Minister to move and speak to the motion.
Moved.
Do any members wish to speak? No members wish to speak. I'd like to put the question on the motion, and the question is that motion S6M 20639 be agreed. Are we all agreed? The amendment. Sorry, the motion has been agreed. I'd like to thank the Minister. Move to the next agenda item. Next, we will hear from the Minister for Public Finance on 2 instruments, subject to the negative procedure, which is what you really touched on last time, but never mind. Revenue Scotland and Tax Powers Act, interest on unpaid tax and interest rates in general, Amendment Regulations 2026, SSI 22617, and the Revenue Scotland and Tax Powers Act involved Third Party Amendment Order 2026, SSI 2026-18, and the Minister supported by the same 3 Scottish Government officials as last time. I'd like the Minister to invite the Minister to make short opening statements covering both instruments.
I just refer the convener to my earlier comments. Thank you.
Okay. Do members have any questions? John? No? Okay. I'd like to thank the Minister and officials for evidence today, unless members have any further comments on either of the instruments. No one does? Okay. Right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your contribution this morning, Minister. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now call
see you again.
Break until the appearance of our next witnesses. Thank you. Agenda today is an evidence session on the Scottish Government Scottish Spending Review 2026. For this item, we are joined by Mirren Kelly, Chief Officer Local Government Finance at COSLA, Jack Gillespie, Interim Deputy Director of Finance, NHS Scotland, Sarah Roughhead, Chief Financial Officer, Police Scotland, and Tiffany Ritchie, Acting Director of Finance at the Scottish Funding Council. So we'll move straight to questions, and as this is in a round table format, I'll ask the first question. We'll see what interest that generates from others around the table, and people just have to catch my eye or that of the clerks to see who speaks next. So we'll try and have as involved a discussion as possible. We were originally going to have a panel, but because there's 4 of you, it's a bit unwieldy, and I think you would all feel duty-bound to ask every question to be here all day. So if we do it this way, I think we'll get round, cover much more ground. So the first question is to Mirren. The Fraser of Allender Institute has warned that, and I quote, "The local government settlement looks very difficult over the 3-year period, particularly as this includes social care, where the Scottish Government has assumed again that there will be growing demands." Close quote. You have any comments on that, Mirren?
I guess I would agree with that summary. I think we can see that there's been levels of sort of improvements with Scottish Government in terms of there is some uncommitted funding that's come through this last year and this year. However, when you look at the demands that are clearly increasing, particularly in social care, but not just social care, that it presents a really, really challenging picture. And alongside that, it's not only the demands for existing services and the increased complexity, there's also quite a lot of incoming additional duties. So, for instance, the right to breaks, when that comes in over the next period, that's several £100 million. And the spending review does kind of pose some questions in terms of where's that funding going to come from, and does it come with an opportunity cost of other parts, and what does that mean kind of across not just local government services but the wider public sector, and what happens there.
The Institute for Fiscal Studies have said that without heroic improvements in productivity, it will almost certainly not be enough to maintain, let alone services. And I'm referring there to the 0.7% increase in health and social care real-term spending.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we've got there in terms of the challenge about like reform and transformation, at present local government has been reforming and transforming for decades. There's been year on year of that real terms cut, while actually additional services are being introduced. So where do you go? And specifically within social care, what does reform of social care actually look like? Because at present, what models are available that aren't individuals going to go, providing care on a person-to-person basis that could actually release some of these efficiencies, which I agree at present would look like they would need to be heroic.
How does the Scottish spending review help? I mean, because obviously you're talking about over a longer period of time as opposed to just annualised budgets. Does that allow you to bring in more efficiencies, for example, in terms of plan more strategically, deliver more effectively?
So it definitely assists in a level of strategic planning, but clearly we have to plan on the basis of the information that's presented in the spending review, which indicates, as identified others, that there is arguably a relative deprioritisation of the local government settlement within that.
Thank you, Craig, and then Michael.
Thank you, Convener. When we put the concerns of COSLA and others to the Cabinet Secretary in relation to the spending review, the impression that we've got is that the spending review is somehow a notional figure and that we should never really set much store by it. What confidence does that give you in terms of having, a 3-year budget cycle that effectively you've got the minister responsible for it saying don't really worry about these figures because something more will turn up? Does that give you any concerns as to how local authorities will therefore plan for the medium to long term?
So directors of finance, Section 95 officers will have to set sort of short, medium and long-term planning and planning assumptions, and they have to use the information that is made available to them to do that. So the information that they have at present is the spending review. Now they can obviously make judgment on some assumptions that they would consider around that in terms of spending scenarios. And I would agree that our past experience would suggest that there can be significant changes within a settlement period, and they may be positive. However, what the spending review sets out at the moment is that the prioritisation of known resources is not heading towards local government.
And obviously some decisions taken by central government have an impact on local government in terms of the wage bill. The Scottish Government also set a 9% pay policy, which appears almost now to have all been spent in the first couple of years within the policy. What, therefore, is COSLA expecting in relation to wage growth within the local government sector in next and future years?
I couldn't possibly predict how negotiations would go with our bargaining groups. However, I do think remaining within a 9% over the 3 years would be a very optimistic assumption to plan on.
And if there's no further money coming forward and the unions don't agree to a real terms cut in wages, what's the net result for other services?
Well, there's always the balance, isn't there, of the what's an affordable offer, what can be there, but there's the trade-off of what are you losing from that, or what are you having to charge for that. So there will be options available, and it will depend on the settlements as it comes through. But what are any new or existing expectations on local government? Actually, has there been the opportunity to reduce some of the expectations, which might free up some resource for those conversations, or is it wholly dependent on cuts to services and increases in fees, charges and council tax?
Okay, thank you.
Hold on a second, we need to let other people in as well. Craig, obviously, being a round table format. And Michael, to follow by Liz.
So, multi-year funding has been a long-term demand of local government who want to be able to plan longer term. And so I suppose committee felt a little bit concerned in terms of we'd all like to see that number going up considerably over time to meet the various needs, but we recognise the challenge of the funding situation then. But part of this is surely about getting local government to deal with the reality that's in front of it. So to have the Cabinet Secretary come to us and then say, well, actually, it might change, we think it probably will change, there'll be more money. How does that actually impact the approach that you take as local government to actually dealing with the hard line, I suppose, difficult scenario that's been presented at the moment? Because it's about whether you wait and hope things get better. What's the practical reality of that?
It makes it challenging because we're still operating effectively in that uncertainty kind of envelope of so in the practical sense then there will have to be considerations about effectively that like scenario planning, so you can develop options that as would be usual, the best made worse, and kind of just operate on them and flex as much as you can between them. But it is very dependent on additionally what your local circumstances are. Are there any shocks within the system? And I think the ability for local authorities to take risks around that are really, really diminished because the reserves have been, cut. There's several, operating with unallocated reserves that are less than what would be, the normal prudent level of 2 to 4%, which means that the amount of risk that can be taken on is reduced than might have been the case 10 years ago when they might have been willing to operate on a slightly less risk-averse approach.
It's only about 1%.
Yeah.
And I think this question probably goes to all representatives here today about the process of engagement from government with your organisations about the figures that have been set out in the spending review. I mean, I think we were all struck by figure 6 in the Scottish Fiscal Commission's report showing local government spending going hard left, other areas smaller decreases, but an increase in other areas. But did you have discussions with the government, and what did they set out to you as the rationale? And I'll maybe ask others to contribute to that as well, in terms of the conversations you've been having with government as part of the spending review process.
So firstly, generally, we've seen, definitely from our point of view, some very good engagement with Scottish Government in increasing over the last couple of years in particular, sort of good sessions with various Cabinet Secretaries to try and deliver the understanding of some of that. I'm aware that there are elements within the spending review and the figures that others may wish to speak to, where some of the funding that we might expect to see isn't there, as in transfers from other portfolios. But again, without having the clarity or indication of what that transfer might be, we don't know what we're operating within, which creates some of the challenge. So in terms of the engagement on the spending review, there was some, but we weren't aware of what, the detail of what was going to be there. But we definitely had the opportunity to have quite a lot of discussions with our spokespeople and others.
Liz and Patrick.
Just very quickly on that point about
the
opportunity cost, given that local government has been deprioritised, as you rightly put out, what extent of discussions have taken place inside COSLA about the opportunity costs, given the extensive demands that you've just mentioned for health and social care? What have you decided? Because you're going to have to make cuts.
It's obviously, it's one of those, it's never as simple for COSLA as a representative of 32 quite unique organisations. So there are obviously, and rightly, local factors at play here in terms of where the priority lies. There are obviously constraints within that in terms of meeting statutory duties, but there are, one of the things that's obviously particularly of a focus will be where the demographic pressures are coming from, because there are certainly some areas with significantly increasing older populations, some areas with increasing young or broader population, and that presents different challenges and will mean they have to make decisions kind of based around that.
Okay, thank you. Patrick, followed by Tiffany.
Thanks. I mean, this is a question that's relevant for COSLA, but relevant, I think, for the other witnesses as well. Very often the phrase public service reform is received by the workforce as code for cuts. Nothing more sophisticated than that. And I wonder to what extent any part of the public sector is managing to have a different kind of conversation with the workforce and their representatives, not just to avoid provoking industrial action, but actually to achieve some buy-in. Very few people working in public services think nothing should change about the way their work is delivered, the way their jobs are organised. But if we don't recast this idea of public service reform in a way that works with the workforce, then inevitably it's going to fail and probably cost more money in the long run by causing disruption and industrial action. So is any part of the public sector managing to have that conversation in a different way that doesn't just raise people's heckles from the start?
Thanks. I mean, Tiffany's keen to come in and she'll be followed by Jack. But Tiffany, Patrick's just touched on public sector reform, and you've said that the SFC's contribution to public service reform is through delivery of the most significant transformation of the tertiary education sector in over a decade. So I'm happy to speak to anything that's gone on before, but I'd be keen on you to follow through with that, given us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Convener, and thank you for the opportunity to be at committee today. So I think two elements I wanted to pick up on, and this is speaking from Scottish Funding Council. We manage about $2 billion for the colleges and universities of Scotland. I think we're absolutely right, the discussion we're having about what public service reform means and getting buy-in to it. We have, particularly on the SFC side, we're going through massive transformation through the TET bill the Tertiary Education and Training Bill, and that's where we're going to take on responsibility for the whole of the apprenticeships function, and a huge number of staff are coming over, and we're going to make sure that it is safely and securely transitioned over. And there's huge benefits from this, and it doesn't focus on, for example, workforce reductions. What it focuses on is how do we transform the system for the end users to make sure that learners and employers, the colleges and universities themselves, have confidence that they can meet demand where it's needed, that the learners who are going through the system, they get what they want out of it. It's not simply, obviously economic growth is vital, but they themselves achieve what they want to from the investment, years of investment they're putting into this. I think there's going to be huge benefits from reducing the administrative burden. So at the moment, you have 2 public bodies requesting data around apprenticeships in different ways for different systems. We can fix that through this public service reform. And lastly, it's bringing things together. And I think that comes to the point about we're discussing an annual budget and the impact it has, a more strategic look at things. So we're bringing together research and innovation with apprenticeships more closely together, so you can look at where the future skills needs and undertake more of that multi-year planning that I think will really benefit. So that's the SFC aspect. I did want to highlight that there's huge reform going on in the college and university sectors, and it ties to that question about what's been the Scottish Government engagement. We have had a step change in engagement with Scottish Government through the recent budget and spending review, much closer working, and with institutions as well. We call it the tripartite alignment groups, but it's where you have universities, colleges, government and SFC working together. And we had a very, I think, joined-up view that was about stabilisation and transformation. We have to undertake radical change at pace, and we have to make sure institutions keep their doors open throughout that. And I think getting buy-in to that was vital, and as part of the reason we got the uplift to the budget in 26-27 was that shared view. Absolutely delighted that Universities Scotland have worked so hard with all the universities, with SFC and Scottish Government, and we've launched this framework for future funding. And there's a parallel work stream with the colleges as well. And that is more joined-up thinking and longer-term planning than I think we've necessarily seen before. And that gives, huge optimism about addressing some of the problems we're facing.
Okay, well, that's, we've got some positive responses. Jack, to be followed by John.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. I was going to come in at the point about reform, and I think in NHS Scotland we are genuinely making the start of a journey, admittedly, into reform, but we are making notable progress, and have a few examples of what that looks like. First of all, in NHS Scotland, it can't just be cuts, because we need to at least maintain, if not improve, service provision. It just needs to be done more financially sustainably. Towards the end of last calendar year, the Scottish Government published the Service Renewal Framework and the Population Health Framework, which sets out a relatively high-level strategy to shift the balance of care into the community, focus on prevention, and in doing so, improve financial sustainability as well as outcomes. And that kind of sets the tone in what we're doing in reform. We've recently asked our boards to collaborate through what we're calling 2 subnational structures, through NHS Scotland East and West, to collaborate across boundaries, improve outcomes, and also on a financial basis to submit an improved financial position on a regional basis, if you want to call it that. And in the next few years, our boards will be implementing a one-stop shop for finance, procurement, HR and payroll systems across NHS Scotland. And that's a really big opportunity for us to reform. It will allow us to collaborate much better. It will allow shared services to be shared across NHS Scotland, and it will provide a really strong platform for reform. And the final thing I wanted to touch on was Digital Front Door, which is something we're implementing just now. It's in NHS Lanarkshire. It's been rolled out there. And that's a digital interface for people to interact with NHS Scotland when required. It's a really exciting opportunity. I think by the end of 2026, we're aiming for about 25% of correspondence to be through that Digital Front Door platform. It should remove 25% of paper correspondence and the costs that associate with that as well. So there are lots of opportunities. We're at the start of a journey, but I think we are making meaningful progress, and we are bringing people along about it. It's not about cuts, it's about how do we change how we do things, and importantly it needs to be more financially sustainable.
I mean, you touched there on the Health and Social Care Service Renewal Framework. I mean, you did talk about a closer collaboration between NHS boards, and you talked about integration of systems. do we have the right number of health boards in Scotland? Because there's an argument that we perhaps have too many health boards, or perhaps even that the health boards should be integrated more with local authorities. So, for example, pick an area where I represent, you've got 3 local authorities established for political rather than practical reasons. You've got the college, which has got the same boundaries. You've got a health board with the same boundaries. Is there not a kind of argument of integrating between local authorities, health boards and indeed the college sector, so that you've got one kind of structure to help both in economic development, skills and indeed delivery of health and other services?
Yeah, it's not. I don't want to comment on the number of health boards. It's not in my area. We are making progress in that area, though. From the 1st of April, National Services Scotland and NHS Education for Scotland will merge and become Public Sector Delivery Scotland, and that will reduce the number of health boards by 1, which is a start. And that.
And then, because you're saying it's a start.
No, I appreciate that. I'm just saying I'm not commenting on the number of.
You know, just feel free. We in this committee, we feel free to say what we think.
Across boundaries and how territorial boards interact. I'm not commenting on whether that's appropriate. However, we are in the national board space. We have committed to doing that for NHS Education for Scotland and NSS. And the idea for that is for the whole to be greater than the sum of the parts, and it will help drive digital innovation in particular across NHS Scotland.
Okay, I've got 4 people so far keen to come in. John, to be followed by Michael.
Thanks so much. It was to follow up with Tiffany Ritchie about the tertiary education and training bill. So, I mean, that comes at quite a cost. And we're not actually losing any public bodies. I mean, we're still going to have SFC and Skills Development Scotland at the end of the day. They're just moving responsibilities. And I take your point that it's going to be more joined up. But, I mean, there's quite a significant cost on pensions, because as soon as the staff move, they're going to have pensions topped up. And there's also, I believe, quite an IT cost. Because you've got to somehow disentangle the SDS system and put a bit of it into SFC. So, I mean, is that inevitable? And others might want to comment that, you know, if we're going to have a bit of rearrangement, and I'm happy to accept that what we end up with is better than what we started with, but there is a big, significant one-off cost to start with. And kind of linked to that, if I could ask the police, who, I mean, you are held up as one of the most significant recent reforms that we've had. We went from 8 bodies to 1, if I'm correct, which I think is a good thing. Has that been a total success? And, you know, financially, is that a good model that we could look to other parts of the public sector to copy?
Thank you. Any views to respond?
Yeah, thank you. So yes, absolutely, to Mr Mason's point, there is going to be transition costs and set out in the financial memorandum, and in the region of 5, potentially 10 million. And that's upfront costs. I think it's a very clear invest-to-save case. And it does set out in the financial memorandum that they will take a number of years to stabilise, but we expect a radically improved system that generates savings thereafter, but not the sorts of job cuts necessarily that folk can't buy into. A newly designed funding body that has a more coherent vision and a better multi-year plan for how we meet demand and support economic growth going forward. We think it will support learner pathways. As I'd mentioned, they're investing. It's an investment of years for learners going to college and university. They should have total efficiency in whether they have one qualification in one place and whether that's built on in another. If they're coming back to reskill or upskill, they should know that that's a currency that's recognised, whatever qualification they take on. We can improve on that. And I do think there's more we can do. We will no doubt touch on it, but our funding model reviews, the credit-based funding system for colleges and the student number-based system for universities, we're looking at those, and I think that would tie with apprenticeships into something that's more flexible and better meets demand. So, significant benefits to come.
Okay, thank you. Michael, to follow by Sarah.
Yeah, sorry, sorry, Sarah, if I can come back on that, Tiffany. I mean, you said that in the engagement with government, you know, it's been a positive situation. It's been mostly focused on our part of focusing on keeping the doors open. I mean, we're in a situation where universities are shedding thousands of jobs right now, and actually across the spending review period, SFC's funding is down by £10 million across the 3-year period. So it's is the settlement that you've got commensurate to the scale of the challenge that people are facing right now? I mean, but these institutions are in crisis, from Aberdeen, Dundee, Strathclyde, Edinburgh, all huge numbers of job losses.
I absolutely agree with Mr Mara on the scale of the challenge. Our financial sustainability reports last September tried to set out quite clearly that we share that view. There's a risk that institutions may close their doors, and the impact on the local community, economy, regionally and nationally of one of our colleges or universities ceasing to be a going concern is absolutely profound. I'm very glad that, and it is a very welcome budget uplift for 26-27, and that will support stabilisation. That will help us ensure that these institutions remain a going concern and start these transformation initiatives and mechanisms that can support longer-term sustainability. But you're right, the sorts of pressures they're facing, such as inflation, those are not going away. And the sorts of transformation that needs to be undertaken will be multi-year. So you're right, we need a multi-year investment. At the moment, we only have level 2 for future years, and on that basis, we cannot issue multi-year allocations to institutions, and that I think we would very much welcome greater certainty and clarity on the multi-year funding. Yes.
Okay. I mean, one of the things that you've said in your submission, actually, Tiffany, is that international fee income is expected to increase from 1,324 million in 23-24 to 1,532 million by 26-27, a 15.7% increase. But projection will be revisited to reflect 2025 student recruitment cycles. Now, there's been quite a significant reduction, I would have thought, in terms of the number of overseas students rather than an increase. So is it not a case that the university sector is made more fragile by the reliance on not just overseas students, but the decisions, for example, taken at Westminster in terms of who can get a visa, etc., etc.?
Yes, Convener. I think you're right that the source of income and the increasing reliance on that source of income from international students does impact on the resilience of universities. I think it's right. We have institutions in Scotland that are world-class, that do participate internationally, and it's right that they should undertake activity that is for international students, that brings in international staff, international income. I think that is the right and proper thing to do. However, as we set out in our September reports, there is a lack of resilience there. It is a more volatile income stream. It is proven volatile, and it will continue to be volatile. So they need to have better risk management practices so they can manage and maintain resilience when those income streams deviate, as they may well. So those forecasts are reasonable based on the evidence, but they're highly volatile, highly subject to change. And we need institutions to be planning and able to adjust at pace should that income not come to bear. The UK VI impact is highly concerning, and we're working with all universities just now to ensure that what planning can be done is being done. There are some taking very proactive steps, which is probably the prudent thing to do. But I share your view that there is a risk around that.
Yeah, I'm going to let Michael in a second, but I was just going to say that you've said in your submission that no university is forecasting a cash deficit throughout the forecast period. However, many institutions are taking proactive steps to keep them in a positive cash position. What sort of proactive steps? Because I think that's...
well,
I think the word proactive can mean a lot of different things.
Absolutely. I think there's two very different pictures between colleges and universities. So on colleges, on the side of the colleges, when they moved to the public sector in 2014, they put the reserves into arm's length foundations, ALFs. There's about 100 million there. It's reduced to near zero now. So the cash reserves for colleges are almost entirely used up. And the graphs in our sustainability report, again, show it's a very straightforward downward trend. We are materially concerned about the cash levels at colleges, and that's part of this effort for stabilisation. Otherwise, they will not continue a going concern. On universities, you don't see that. It looks like the cash balances at universities have remained reasonably healthy. What that doesn't, the graph cannot show you, is that the source of their income has changed. It's moved from largely government funding to largely international student income, and that they're also highly leveraged. And they're not unique. It's not only universities in Scotland, it's true across the piece, but it is also true in Scotland. So they're relying on their lenders, and their lenders have bank or lending covenants that must be met. So if the international income changes, there's a deviation, there's a risk of breaching their bank covenant, at which point they very suddenly will not have the cash they require. And that's what we saw happen with the institution in Dundee.
Okay.
So yeah, there's a fragility there.
For let's say, and Michael wants to come back on this.
The circumstances in Dundee, I think, are fairly unique in terms of across the sector, in terms of the management practice, people who can read management accounts on all kinds of issues. I mean, an absolute disaster and a disgrace. I suppose I'm more concerned about the SFC's record on the broader sector. I mean, you're sounding alarms here, and the SFC are doing that more generally about the sustainability of the sector. But it feels to me like the SFC has been asleep at the wheel on this for years as the sector has become more leveraged, has become more reliant on risky funding over internationally. And we've not really heard the Scottish Funding Council telling that story to the public about actually these precious institutions, as you say, so important. So what's different in terms of what the SFC is doing now than it was that you allowed to steer us into this mess in the first place?
Yeah, no, thank you, Mr. Maher. I think it is absolutely right that the public is fully aware of the risks in the system. I think our sustainability reports in September were a way to make that much clearer, perhaps, than had been previously. I think there has been a step change itself in the institution. So this has been a long-term process, but one where, for example, I would say in the last few years, the risk from these economic factors, global macroeconomic trends that universities are exposed to, it has become more volatile. So international student income 5 years ago was not as risky a proposition as it is today. We have never seen the sort of changes in, for example, American or Chinese students that we have in recent years. COVID-19 had a profound impact on that as well. So I think the nature of the risk has increased. I think we are offering more transparency or continuing transparency of their reporting. However, as you say, given the increase in risk, are we reflecting on our practices in SFC? Absolutely. We naturally engage with private sector specialists, Department for Education, Office for Students down south, or Welsh counterparts, Audit Scotland and other public service specialists to ensure that we're leading edge in our institutional scrutiny. We've agreed a programme to enhance our institutional scrutiny, which we're implementing now across 4 areas. One of them is there's just a slight suggestion that institutions weren't clear on the expectations from SFC. And we want to make sure that that does not remain any suggestion of uncertainty going forwards. So we're reissuing our financial memorandum. We've issued fresh guidance around governance. The second area is saying that we are a huge holder of data and we get in a lot of financial data returns. But a lot of the issues with institutions, including the choices they make about the portfolio of income they accept, relate back to management decisions and performance, the quality of the leadership and the governance. And that's further upstream. And we want to catch that before it becomes a financial issue. So we're looking at more performance data, lead indicators, where there could be a problem in an institution well before it becomes a financial issue. The third item was recognising that, again, we get a lot of data returns, but they only tell you so much. It tells you that on paper things may be working, but in practice they may not. It may be that the Finance Committee isn't reading the management accounts, or the chair of the Audit Committee isn't challenging as they should. So we're actively going to be engaging more directly with those members of governance to ensure that we can see things working in practice, not just on paper. And then the fourth area of enhancing institutional scrutiny is interventions. And that's just having a little more grit when we engage with institutions and where we see folk not meeting our expectations that we have clarified, that they realise there are material repercussions and that we're very clear on those from the outset. And the TET bill was helpful in that regard. It has helped formalise some of our interventions, for example, independent examinations.
Thank you. We've got other folk keen to come in. Sarah, you're obviously keen to come in, but I wonder if you can also touch on the Police Scotland's Estate Master Plan, which will release around £50 million to £80 million of capital receipts over the next 5 to 10 years. And that means you'll be able to invest, for example, in body-worn video to frontline police officers and staff and roll out the digital evidence sharing capability. So, as well as whatever you were wanting to contribute, I was hopeful that you would touch on that also.
Of course. Thank you, Convener, and thank you for the invite today. So if I combine that all with Mr Mason and Mr Harvey's questions as well, I think the committee will be aware that Police Scotland has undertaken significant reform since 2013, and the figures sort of speak for themselves. Specifically, £2.5 billion has been saved over the last 10 years. and that we are approximately saving around 300 million on an annualised basis from the service. That has included a workforce reduction that Mr Harvey was speaking to already, from around 24,000 officers and team members to less than 22,500 today. And that also includes, together with a centralisation of enabling functions. That's the reform that we've undertaken, and that has been recognised both by Scottish Government, being explicit within the SSR about the £2.5 billion saved, but also the Criminal Justice Committee in December, stating that reform within police and fire, who have also gone through a major reform, is an unmatched achievement in the public sector. But they also noted, and this is what I'll come to, is that there is the room for further savings is now exhausted, and some of some of those savings must now be reinvested back into the areas. I agree that reform is not just about efficiencies and cash savings. It's about capability building and capacity building from within. And some of the areas that you've touched upon is absolutely part of the digital transformation that we've already started undertaking. So body-worn video is very well progressed in terms of rollout, and that is a key sort of enabler in terms of creating efficiencies and getting more officer frontline hours back onto the front line. The digital evidence sharing capability, again, is not just around efficiencies and reform within Police Scotland itself. It's that portfolio view, so that end-to-end, and working with our partners within the justice portfolio about how do we get evidence in a sort of to prevent duplication, to prevent that manual time within. So they are both well progressed and continue, and it's that sort of digital transformation that we include as part of our reform ask. I think what's important within the context of Police Scotland when we're thinking about reform is the two elements that are stated within the SSR. So the 0.5% further headcount reduction each year. Now, the SSR is explicit that the front line should be protected, and I think that's a key question, that what is the definition of front line in terms of protection? So we count that as officers, C3, criminal justice. And if we were to take that sort of level of reform, a 0.5%, I can speak to the numbers, a 0.5% headcount reduction is relatively limited in terms of our impact. So our team members are all valuable, but that reduction is manageable over the period, equating to less than 50 team members. But it's critical. What is protection of frontline? That we understand that. The bigger issue, if I may, is that flat cash position in resource funding, and it's a real terms reduction over the period in both resource funding and capital funding that we have that has been allocated to Scottish Government or informed by the SSR. So in terms of resource funding on our 1.6 billion budget, based on OBR and Bank of England current inflation baselines, resources a real-term reduction of 5.8%, and capital will be a real-term reduction of 14.8%. And this is significant. And it's that connotation that flat cash, given our pay, non-pay, the reform that we've done, plus the pay, non-pay ratio that we have. So our pay bill accounts for 86% of our costs. And so a flat cash position really does have strong implications in terms of how we would fund that unfunded position, and it would inevitably be through our team members.
I think Police Scotland is in an interesting position because I think, reducing from, as John touched on earlier, from 8 police forces to 1 had a huge positive impact. You don't have 8 chief constables, and all the bureaucracy that goes with that, 8 headquarters, etc., etc. The old days when, where I live, which is 3 miles from the Renfrewshire border, if there was an incident, they would send a police car for Irvine 40 minutes away when there could be one sitting in Lochwinnoch, 5 minutes away because they weren't allowed to cross even internal borders within Circleville. So I think there's been a huge improvement in service delivery. And one of the things we try and talk about as a committee is about outputs rather than inputs. But I take your point that the police have done so many of these reforms and they have delivered lower crime levels, homicide levels. I think last year were a record low in Scotland. And it's about where, and I think, do you feel that that government are of the view that, well, you know, Police Scotland continue to improve in terms of the key issues facing us, you know, such as reduced crime with less money, so perhaps they're not a priority that they perhaps should be, and that's ignoring, for example, things like specialist areas like cybercrime, where there's been a huge increase relative to other forms of crime. So how do you, what kind of relationship do you have with government in terms of conveying the fact that, yes, we've made huge transformations over the last decade or so and more, but we're at a stage now where we can't continue on the same course?
So we have very regular engagement, as you would expect, between both the SPA, the authority, and the Chief Deps, the leadership team with Scottish Government. We have been absolutely clear throughout the SSR process and the budget submission that we haven't completed reform. We have done an extraordinary amount with reform. There is still more we want to do, and we are ambitious about that, and I spoke to digital transformation. But we are lean. We have taken significant savings, and we also are seeing, you know, in-year unfunded pressures. And that creates that 14% of non-pay savings. We are, you know, getting leaner and leaner and trying to be as efficient as possible. But reform takes, in my view, space, and it takes time. It can't be done in a scenario where business as usual pressures are increasing. We have that engagement, and we were absolutely clear as part of our pre-budget scrutiny with the Justice Committee, and they recognise this, that a flat cash scenario, which is what is being proposed within the SSR, we cannot meet a balanced budget under those circumstances, and it will have significant operational implications.
Okay, I'm sure these are issues we will put to the Cabinet Secretary when she comes to us. Mirren to be followed by Michelle, yeah.
Yeah, just to pick up the very much welcome the roundtable approach that's been taken here. A couple of things I wanted to pick up, Convener. You mentioned about the opportunities around the reform of organisations, and I'm sure you're aware that there's significant interest from local authorities in terms of exploring the single authority model. Clearly, you know, there's a few island authorities that have been really keen on that for a number of years, and we're seeing some really positive progress in terms of discussions around that. But it's not limited to islands. The Ayrshires are engaging kind of on some hopefully really transformational options within that, and I think there are opportunities there. I guess one of the things I would flag kind of from the local authority point of view is that sometimes people look at local authorities and go, oh, there's 32 of them, there's a lot. Do you need that many? Forgetting quite how much local authorities deliver across that. So there's 32 organisations delivering hundreds and hundreds of things kind of within that space. So the presumption of...
So in Ayrshire you've got, you know, a joint integrated board, a health board and 3 local authorities, and you've got 3. So although there is already cross local authority working, sometimes there isn't, and sometimes you do have shared services and sometimes you don't. I just think one structure under democratic control, and I'm not saying it, I've been saying this for about 12 years, incidentally, and I'm glad that, you know, at snail's pace we're actually moving forward, at least on the islands, because it seems daft to me that you've got, in some of the islands, you've actually got a lot of overlap between the people who are actually running the health board and running the local authority, you know, moving from same people moving from meeting A to meeting B to meeting C. So it just seems to me that it's in the long term, it's a sensible approach. Of course, the issue about those kind of reforms is they are themselves expensive. I mean, it's not like you can just suddenly flick a switch. They will themselves will cost a significant amount of money and take a lot of time. But it just seemed to me that a country of 5.4 million people, when you've got, you know, community planning partnerships and you've got city deals and you've got this, that and the other, it seems that a much less cluttered public landscape would be more effective and efficient. And I think what's happening with the Scottish Funding Council is a good way forward in terms of trying to integrate more services into one structure.
Yeah, I don't disagree with the opportunities there, and I think as well we share some of the questions that Police Scotland have in terms of what's frontline, because
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think we need an explanation from the government about it. It's because if all of us were to go around the table and say, what do frontline services mean to you? You know, and I mean, people who themselves, you may not consider frontline, or I may not consider, will consider themselves frontline. I mean, when we were at the last Spice briefing, I spoke at and they said, what is frontline services? I says, well, nobody in here, you know, would be considered frontline services by the general public. And yet some of those people do consider that. So I think we do need a definition of that. And of course, the thing about frontline services is they don't actually work without people behind the scenes. And I think that's perhaps not. It's an easy it's a kind of lazy thing to say. More money into frontline. It's about what that means. I think is important.
That's a really important conversation for us to be having, because, and actually more and more when you move into some of the digital opportunities, you're traditionally viewed as back office, non-frontline IT staff are actually delivering the frontline services through that. So how do you kind of capture that and balance that in?
Fly without air traffic control, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I wouldn't want to test it. But yeah, so just for example, in terms of within the local government workforce, our FTE is 213,000, of which 53,000 of those are teachers. So 25% of our staff are teachers, and they make up about more than a third of the pay bill as well. But I would assume the view might be that teachers count as frontline. It's like, well, that's 25% of staff that are protected within that, and you quickly go through kind of your staff. It's like, well, your refuse collectors, they're frontline. There's a like where'd you get to, and then as you say, you're left with some people, but they are the people that are doing the payroll and doing the accounts and keeping the IT services. So it's really, really challenging,
helpful is even a helpful description, frontline. I mean, what does it really mean? Because it's a team approach that delivers any service.
Yeah, I prefer viewing kind of the organisation as a whole in terms of that, rather than sort of a definition between there because of that.
Fine. A number of people keen to speak, which I'm pleased about. Michelle, to follow by John.
Picking up a comment on Frontline, and I'm guessing it's the case for all the organisations, that the work that's been done over successive years, so that there's a clear understanding of how every function is delivering into the frontline, that must have been done. So I completely agree with your argument. I've got a small question for the Funding Council, and then I wanted to ask a general one. It's just picking up on your comment about leverage and the issue around bank covenants. I wanted to just get a reflection from you, the extent to which that is being gamed in, given what we saw in 2008, where the mechanisms that existed that represented a minor technical breach of covenant in banking contracts, therefore provided the excuse for some quite rapier behaviour by private banks that exist to make profit, and where we saw asset stripping of various businesses. Now, stepping away from the purpose, actually many of the universities in particular, their assets are significant. How well equipped, in your opinion, is the organisation that is the SFC to understand this? And it does go back to what we all learned in 2008, and also individual universities themselves. And the last time I asked this question was in the Education Committee. John Mason was there as well, and ironically enough, it was at that time the principal of Dundee University. And, well, we saw how that worked out.
Thank you. So I agree with you. I think this is an area where we need to maintain our scrutiny. We work very closely with the main lenders and meet with them regularly to understand what is their agenda, what is their appetite, what is their view of the sector. I would say I think the reputation of the universities in Scotland is so strong. And even those that have got into financial difficulty have continued to perform well in all the international league tables, that their credit quality is very high. and that's something we actively monitor. We undertake reviews and sort of report at least annually to our own finance committee on how is the lending environment looking, what is the future repayment schedule, and what confidence do we have in institutions. And for example, met with one of them, their CFO, in recent weeks to specifically discuss and how are you managing your cash balances to ensure you manage to meet your covenants. So I think my experience is that the university senior finance leaders are very aware of the risk and monitoring and managing this very closely. But you're right, this is something we'll have to stay very alive to as we go forward. I would say we've had a number of institutions where they have taken proactive steps. They've seen that their international exposure is not optimal. They've seen that there could be, for example, an issue in Nigeria or another country that could affect them, and they've proactively reached out to us, their external auditor and their lender, to have a proactive discussion about could we flex for a period, flex our bank covenants to ensure we don't have an issue while we take the steps to rectify the situation. And those have been very constructive discussions. So I think much closer working. And I do think that things like the Gillies review have highlighted how important that is. So folk are paying more attention to that now.
Yeah. And my general question for everybody, and I'm not going to pick anyone to go first because you're all in different stages of evolution. We always have a sort of dance in this committee where you'll notice the convener kind of teases somebody into just pushing the dial a wee bit. And I suspect, from my rationale, the reason for that is that some organisations will always want to hedge culturally. We're on it because actually they're very aware that all of the evidence given is going to be picked up by government. So they don't want to step over a line. Also, there's sometimes internal challenges. So I suppose it's a general question about culture. How equipped do you think each of your organisations is to really understand the potential scale of the threats that are coming down the track, which I think are deeply significant? And therefore, how ready are you really? In other words, could you actually be able to go faster than government itself is able to anticipate? And have you got that kind of push and pull? Because the short-termism that we have, we've got 2 electoral cycles in this Parliament, that plays into what realistically can be done, and that may potentially could threaten some of the speed of change. So I don't know whether Mirren or you're both nodding whether who wants to come in there first, but
it's challenging within the. There's challenges and opportunities, aren't there around? I think one of the constraints for the opportunities for local government is that we have to operate within the existing legislative and policy requirements and delivering lots and lots of services that are fundamentally critical to individuals and communities. So the opportunity to make radical changes without the support of Scottish Government is limited because of that. Local authorities are also part of the ones caught up in the political cycle, which absolutely has an impact on some of that. And there's almost a bit about the point at which people are politically willing to test radical change, and how does that fit in with the cyclical nature of some of what we go through. So, yeah.
I mean, I'd be interested in your thoughts as well, Tiffany, but I personally don't hear a great deal of recognition of these are real blockers in change terms. Obviously, we've talked already about multi-year funding, but these cycles and how they inhibit risk-taking and the extent of the change we need is obviously much more risky. I don't know if anyone just wants to close off.
I should say, I have like council tax, which is an issue we've touched on many times. Reform is one of the... Yeah. That's an area which is particularly affected by the electoral cycle, I would suggest. Yes, Tiffany, what you come in on that? And then I've got 4 others who are keen to come in.
Thank you. I think it's a very fair question, Ms Thompson. I would say that SFC itself and our 161 staff very confident and have a strong appetite for reform. I think because we have worked with the universities and colleges and Scottish Government to do some of that longer term forecasting, I think we agree with you. We can see the scale of the problems potentially coming down the road and the scale of radical change that's needed. I don't think
SFC itself is going to be the answer. I think we've sort of, and we can see the impact. It's SFC working with the universities and the colleges. It's working with the government, and not just the government sponsor team who work on education, but we're working cross-government. So the Economy Directorate, they're trying to stimulate the regional partnerships. How do they go about that? Well, we can help. The Health Directorate, they're trying to ensure that they have the right qualified staff available at the right time. Again, that's something that we can support colleges and universities to make sure that you do get all your places filled that you need to. And local government, we were talking, what can you do about the geography of the thing? We've been working at a college infrastructure investment plan. How can we make best use of all the assets in the state available? Because some of them are not fully utilised. And we have a number of institutions where, at one university, for example, exploring, well, could the local health service run clinics on its premises when there is lower demand? And I think that innovation is wonderful. I think the other side of it is it's multi-year planning, absolutely, and it's more creative thinking. It's very hard, and I don't know if it was perhaps Ms. Ruff had said, it's very hard to come up with the innovation and creativity needed for transformation when you're trying to do the keeping the doors open and firefighting. And I do think 26-27 may be an opportunity for that stabilisation transformation. And we have got, we're so lucky at SFC, we have this research and innovation link. We have some of the brightest minds, Scotland globally, available who are doing research into these sorts of areas, transformation across the world. Where are the best examples? What are they doing, for example, in New Zealand, where it is huge geographies, very diverse, Highlands and Islands style. What do they do to transform their public services across the silos? So I think huge opportunity there as well.
Okay, thank you. John, to be followed by Michael.
Thanks, Convener. Yes, IJBs were mentioned earlier, so I suppose this is aimed at either COSLA or the health side or both. I mean, are they a bad example of public sector reform? Because it seems to me we started with two bodies, health and local government, and we thought we want them more joined up, so we've ended with three bodies. And we've got the IJBs or HSCPs as well. And it came up recently, well, it's coming up at the moment, the Care Experience Bill, which is going through Parliament. So now, instead of children having, there being two organisations in service planning, we're now looking at having three organisations in service planning. So, I mean, has that saved any money? Has it cost extra money? Is it a good example, or is it just what? And the other issue I wanted to raise was the committee on the whole seems to be enthusiastic about zero-based budgeting, and I am personally very very sceptical about it, because we have hospitals, we have colleges, we have schools. We can't just kind of abolish them and say, right, we'll start tomorrow at zero.
Not convinced that's how zero-based budgeting
clearly,
works.
the convener and I don't agree on this. So maybe somebody who's enthusiastic about zero-based budgeting could persuade me. Thank you.
I think it's to look afresh, actually, rather than just, grow arms and legs on the original structure. Is to actually go back to first principles and say what is it that we're actually trying to deliver in terms of outputs. And
on this subject?
Sorry?
Would you like a debate just on this subject, would you?
Probably this isn't the right forum for it, John, but certainly it's something that the Scottish Government have said they would actually look at. I think it's somewhat uneven as to whether or not they have. And I was actually going to ask our guests, which I might do further on, about what their organisations are doing, how they feel about that, and whether they are taking that approach. But I think, given the fact that we've got a number of people who want to speak, I shall forgo that for the time being, because Michael wants to come in, to be followed by Sarah and then Jack.
Yeah, it's a question regarding health. So, Jack, perhaps if you could deal with that after me. So the majority of the savings in the spending review fall within health, so 1 billion of the 1.5 billion. Just wondered what detail you've had about how those savings will be measured and reported against for government.
The savings forecast across the SSR from NHS boards is fully based on a 3% recurring savings delivery from each board. They will report to Scottish Government quarterly or monthly, depending on the time of year. So we've got a very frequent flow of information on what each board is doing. We also ask them to complete self-assessments and understand where they're performing against their own savings target, where it's maybe falling behind. And what we do is we share progress across NHS Scotland. So if Glasgow's falling behind and Lanarkshire or not, they can learn from each other. We have really good data on what each board is delivering and how that contributes to the 3% recurrent savings target, which is fed up into the Scottish Government and forms part of routine reporting. So I think we do have really good assurance over what they're delivering, when and how.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, to be followed by Jack.
It's just to follow up on a few comments and questions raised across the discussion. In terms of Ms Kelly's discussion around workforce mix and particularly thinking about Police Scotland, threat, harm and risk and the nature of crime, to your point, is changing, cybercrime as an example. And therefore, when we are thinking about planning and the review period in front of us, we've been really clear. We've just had a best value audit, which was incredibly positive around our governance and our vision, but that we need to do more, and we recognise we need to do more around workforce planning, and that includes that workforce mix. I think what's important is that, combined with the digital transformation, is what does that resource, quite a techie point, but what does the resource versus capital allocations look like? That will be very different for, I'm sure, each of the witnesses around the committee in 18 months, 3 years, 5 years, as we move from an old sort of capital infrastructure estate to digital licensed software, which all need to be resource funding. So I think that's an important point when we're talking about workforce mix and allocations going forward. And then following up on Ms Thompson's point and bringing in your 50 to 80 million estates master plan. So we've been really clear about our estates master plan over the next 10 years, over 500 million we were expecting with an annual budget. We were hopeful, we were ambitious around over 100 million, and that we would be able to reinvest that 50 to 80 million across the estate, which is incredibly important just for our welfare, but also that capability building in terms of digital. But when we're thinking about reform, and if we bring anything closer to government, I just wanted to flag Police Scotland in 2013 lost its power as it was brought closer to central government. We lost our power to borrow. We lost our power to roll reserves. And these are, in really restricted sort of funding requirements, incredibly important for us. And it's something that we've been sort of speaking to Mr McKee about. But it's just that added element that not unintended consequences, but almost that thought through that is needed when we're talking about reform and what our budgets look like going forward. And Mr Mason, I'm not going to try and persuade you on zero-based budgeting one way or the other, but I mean,
things like zero budgeting, it's stuff like, for example, you know, we've always had a meeting on a Monday morning because we've always had a meeting on a Monday morning. So it's about looking at little things like that sometimes and saying, do we really need to do that? Can we do something else, you know, with that time, and et cetera, et cetera. So it can be on quite a mundane level. It doesn't necessarily have to be, should we have a Khmer Rouge approach, John, whereby we do, you know, and I seem to remember you in the session 11 to 16 calling for the closure of hospitals and all the money being given to GP practices. It is on the public record. So that's clearly the thing that's been in your head for a wee bit for a while, but that's not what it's about. It's about, within a structure, looking at where resources can be more efficiently allocated by saying, do we really need to do that? Do we really need to do this? Or could we more effectively move resources somewhere else?
And I think in that respect, in an organisation that deals with threat, harm and risk every day, that's where we allocate our team and our resource. But I think when we're looking at reform and zero-based budgeting to some extent in that regard, I think it's really important to think about the role of each office and institution within the portfolio. For example, lots of, if we need to become more effective and build our internal capacity and capability within Police Scotland, we need to look at what is our role, and often we are the service of first and last resort. And so what is our role? And the Chief was clear in the SPA board last week about our interconnectivity with health and responding to mental health call-outs. And so I think it's that broader view across the system that would be helpful as well, in terms of who is responsible and what is the appetite and for proportionate response in each of these areas.
I mean, that issue of mental health is a growing one, because, I mean, some years ago even it was revealed that more than half of all the cases that were taken to the Children's Panel, for example, have a mental health component. And there's a real issue about training, isn't it, about how well trained police officers are to deal with some of these so often distressing kind of incidents that they have to deal with, where mental health appears to be a growing component. So I think the evolution of police, people think of police services, I think the general public often think of the Bobby on the beat in the police station in the centre of the town, and we've moved a long way from that, and I think perceptions haven't changed to go with it. Okay, Jack, we're back to yourself. I don't know if zero-based budgeting is part of what NHS Scotland are doing at the moment. You can perhaps tell us, and then we'll be followed by Craig.
I was going to touch on Ms Thompson's point about the appetite for reform and the pace of that. I think in NHS Scotland, as I said earlier, we have set the direction of travel, and we've set a strategy, and I think the appetite is certainly there, both from Scottish Government and from our health boards. But it needs to be a sort of working in partnership, collective effort to do that, and that is happening. We do have sort of frequent forums. Those two subnational structures meet frequently and discuss how to deliver the terms of the subnational planning directive and the population health and service renewal frameworks. But I guess I think collaboration has to be at the start of that, and has to be going through that together as opposed to one going before the other. And with regard to zero-based budgeting, I don't have thoughts. You obviously feel very strongly about it one way or the other. But just to provide some assurance, with the spending review in particular, there was a real deep dive into each budget line ahead of that. So when you're talking about the really mundane things, convener, they do happen, and they can happen without zero-based budgeting, but I'm staying out of that because you obviously feel very strongly about it.
Okay, Michael, you wanted to comment on that?
Is it not then a little bit strange if you're diving right into the depth of the budget lines that then the other side of it only comes out at level 2? There's a few raised eyebrows at that point. I mean, the government hasn't produced the detail back to you all in terms of if you've examined these spending lines right down, but you want more detail, I think, is the sound of things. Is everyone in agreement with that? The level 2 is just as insufficient, and it's not commensurate to the level of the examination that you made as organisations.
Can I come in? So on the level of detail in the level 2, I appreciate that more detail helps you guys challenge and scrutinise, and that's of course very important. I think there's a balance to strike there between providing an appropriate amount of detail and then providing some space to manage in your volatility, especially across a 3-year forward look. So level 2 is where it came out, and I can appreciate that more detail would be helpful, but things like tariffs or conflicts or hyperinflation could render those detailed numbers relevant quite quickly, and we need to give ourselves a bit of space to deliver within that.
Was it SFC that said that you wanted beyond level 2, so what would be the counter to that argument?
Absolutely. So I think even level 3 would help us. The colleges and universities are making multi-year investments in learners. They could not ever countenance taking on a student that wouldn't then be funded to complete their course. So for our selfish purposes, the level 3 at least would be highly useful. I think a recognition, a flexibility in the approach used by government, so that there's a recognition where there is in-year volatility that changes can be made. Perhaps that would be what would need to come alongside greater planning certainty. We do have a large number of in-year budget transfers, but perhaps that could be improved upon.
So do they. That's one of the issues that this committee has been wrestling with for a while. Craig, to follow by Liz.
Thanks, Kenny. Contained within the spending review over the next 3 years is a very significant shift in the focus of health expenditure away from hospitals towards community-based healthcare. So the overall budget rises by 2.4% in real terms, whereas for national and territorial health boards, it's 0.4%. That means that other areas, for example, community-based healthcare, primary care, see much more significant increases of, I think, roughly 12%. The Institute for Fiscal Studies therefore says that for health boards to be able to continue to deliver, they're going to have to make 3% annualised efficiency savings, and the IFS described that as potentially heroic when compared with the recent capacity to deliver efficiency savings. If health boards, some of which, for example, Dumfries and Galloway, are at stage 3, of the support and intervention framework as a result of the financial pressures. If health boards don't deliver those 3% savings in efficiency, what is the risk to the sustainability of Scotland's hospitals and those health boards? And how would the Scottish Government have to step in? Would that then move resource away from primary care and community care, or draw it from elsewhere? Or is there a risk that some of our health boards could effectively go to the wall between now and the end of the decade?
So a lot to unpack there. The shift towards the community is in line with the priorities set out within the SRF and PHF. Achieving 3% recurrent savings for our health boards will be really difficult, and it's a difficult space for them to operate in. I think the Audit Scotland, NHS and Scotland report quotes 2.2% recurrent savings in 24/5, but 2 years before that it was 1.1, and it's doubled in that 2-year period. So it's on the correct trajectory, and it will be a really difficult position for them to achieve, but it is achievable, and our boards are totally bought into that, and it's completely and totally reinforced by Scottish Government about the importance of those 3% savings. With regards to movements on the support and intervention framework, NHS Dumfries and Galloway at stage 3, it really depends, but I would note that the support and intervention framework is there to provide support and improve performance. A good example of that would be NHS Grampian, who were escalated to stage 4 in May 2025 for finance, leadership and governance, so not just finance. At the time, the rate of overspend was really concerning, and it was forecast to decline further. They were moved to stage 4, they received increased support and scrutiny and challenge, and they are on course to meet key financial targets, and they are presenting a credible plan to sort of return financial sustainability. So it's a really difficult question to answer with granularity, because there's 22 health boards, each with their own challenges. However, on a Scotland basis, if board's financial position in particular does spiral, the support and intervention framework is there to support and help turn it around in a way that is appropriate to that board in that position.
And how easy would it be to pivot back away from community-based healthcare and primary care? Because obviously those will be commitments to move that resource back. I suppose what I'm asking is potentially the government would have to look at portfolios like local government and justice if they find there's inflexibility between those two areas of healthcare in Scotland.
That would depend on each board's circumstances and the reason for escalation. The strategy to invest in the community is there, and that will be seen through. And I guess it would depend on each circumstance of each board and escalation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Just before by Mirren.
Yes, can I just explore a bit further on the back of the question that Mr Mason asked Mirren and Jack about IJBs, because Mr Mason's pointing out that effectively they are a third body that's involved in a decision-making process. You've got your local government, you've got your health board, you've got your IJB. And certainly in my part of the country, there's been a lot of criticism about IJBs. And I just wondered if you both feel that the IJB structure is the most effective way of delivering services, or whether we should be looking to something else.
So I won't comment on whether an IJB is appropriate.
Go on.
But I do.
I mean, that's what we're looking at Scottish spending review and large sums of public money, so we want people to be very straightforward and all that, and exactly what they think. If you think that the greatest thing to sliced bread, tell us. If you think it's the work of Satan, tell us that as well. No, I imagine that your view will be somewhere between those two extremes, but we're really keen to hear it.
What I was going to say is that, as Mirren said, there's a lot of organisations at play here, and a lot of IJBs, and there's variation in how they perform, their financial sustainability, and how they interact with the services. So I think across Scotland, there's good practice and bad practice.
So is that a leadership thing then?
Well, it depends on services, infrastructure, leadership, financial sustainability. It's not as simple as here's one problem that applies to all. I think it is a...
One of the things in addressing Mr Mason's point as well as yours, that there's still a point of IJBs are relatively young. Like they're 10 years-ish old, and there was a period of the pandemic, which means that there was some really acute challenges thrown in really quite early on in their establishment. So I think the intent of IJBs is a really positive one. It's meant, you know, it's meant to provide that better integration across two quite big, complex organisations to achieve better outcomes for people there. I do agree that they're not perfect, but some of that's still this bedding in quite a significant cultural change, which there's been really significant positive progress on that.
The way about integration joint boards, you've got you know, Greater Glasgow and Clyde is absolutely massive,
yeah.
And you've got all these different local authorities within that, so it's not even a balance in terms of the conversation that you're having, because you've got Inverclyde, Renfrewshire, East Renfrewshire, blah blah blah, up Glasgow, all part of that.
And the needs across those IJBs
very massively,
vary hugely, which is, I think, why there are risks in just potentially picking everything up to one or two bigger bodies, because if you lose the ability to adapt to actually what your local circumstances and needs are. So I think there's absolutely opportunities for improvement there, and there really are challenges, and the financial challenges that
so how can they be improved? You've said there are opportunities for improvement, so can you give us some examples of how they could be improved?
I mean, the joint sort of agreement to kind of shift that focus towards the care and the community, I think is significantly better for individuals and communities, and that's kind of the focus, as mentioned, of the renewal framework and the population health framework, and that's around there. And I think it's the learning from what is and isn't working, because there's good practice and there's bad practice, and we need to support that happening. And one of the things I kind of wanted to reflect on as well was we need to be really alive to the risk of cost shunting in decisions that are made.
That's why the IGBs were established.
Exactly.
Because councils and health boards were always trying to push the burden onto each other, frankly.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So they should be allowing for that space of that coherent, integrated conversation about where should the investment be going.
Is there better accountability for decision making with IGBs than there was prior to that?
Don't think it's for me to comment on that one.
Of course it is. She's asking you directly. I think we're going to have to use instruments of torture in this round table. Okay, Mirren, you were actually next to speak. So obviously Liz was asking something specific, but I'm keen for you to have the opportunity to say what you wanted to say before Patrick comes in.
I just wanted to pick up some of the conversation that's been had about capital, because within the spending review period, the capital position is obviously really dire. So I won't beat about the bush on that one. Now, from a local government perspective, we have an enormous public estate, and that's a real concern in terms of the ability to maintain that. Kind of as some have been commenting, that local authorities don't have a challenge in borrowing. Availability of borrowing is not the issue. It is the affordability of borrowing and the commitment that you then have on your future revenue budgets if you've had to borrow to do that. And I guess there's some serious questions need to be had and levers required by local government to potentially consolidate and rationalise the public estate, because there are barriers that exist around that, particularly around the school estate, and challenges that local authorities then face in terms of what can be done. And there's some really good conversations that have been had, like across partners, about the co-location and doing that. So I think there's that needs to be there. But there are key infrastructure assets that we need to consider. Is there enough money going in to maintain them? So, you know, the road network, 93% of the road network is with local authorities. Only 7% is in the trunk network, and there's an increase in funding for that and flat cash capital for local authorities, and we've got
scheduled to reduce over the next 5 years. It's going to be the same in 2029-30 as it was in 23-24 in real terms. That's only if you accept the GDP deflator, which I think is a poor measure of capital. So one of the things that the Scottish Futures Trust have suggested, I wasn't really going to go into this today because I was going to save it for next week, but they've talked about innovative funding mechanisms such as road pricing or congestion charging. But, you know, people, motorists already pay 63.54 pence per litre, for example, in fuel duty plus the VAT. It's on that. They also pay VAT on whatever else is charged on a litre, so probably 70-80 pence, 70-75 pence a litre. They also pay road tax. So are these realistic, deliverable? How popular would they be? I think we know the answer to that. You know, what other mechanisms can there be in terms of trying to bring in additional capital for things like routine maintenance? Because I think we've all driven along some of the horrific roads. It's an issue across the entire UK, I have to say. There's a big problem with it, and governments have kind of tackled it in a half-hearted way. The UK government's put significant money into that, but then apparently the money's been used for things other than what it's supposed to be used for. So would you like to see, for example, as part of the annual capital allocation, a ring-fenced fund for potholes over and above the normal local government capital allocation distributed in terms of the way that the normal distribution formula is used?
our starting position on that is no. We don't. You know, we're not a fan of.
In addition to the normal capital allocation, you would say no to that.
We would.
That's interesting.
We would prefer it not be ring fenced.
Right.
Is the answer there? We are open to conversations around
capital allocation.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Fair enough. Okay. It's a good way of putting it. I'm glad we got that out. Right. Okay. Patrick.
Thank you, Convener. I'm tempted to follow up on the transport policy aspects of the last question, or perhaps to encourage COSLA to look at, rather than just capital, the opportunity to have the power to make decisions about road pricing as a source of revenue generation in the future to meet those needs. What I was going to ask, though, is about how we use the spending review, not just what it contains, but how we use it going forward. We've had obviously quite a long time where the emphasis has been on single-year budgets, and people have talked about the value that a longer-term look ahead would give us. But we need to be realistic about what it can include. It's never going to include the level of detail or the level of absolute certainty that some people would wish from it. It's, if you like, a first sketch of the government's intention or expectation about its spending plans. What I don't get from it is a sense of how the government will apply priorities if it finds that it has more or less slack in its budget going forward in the years that the spending review period covers. Will they, for example, choose to prioritise preventative spending, or will they choose to prioritise real terms pay settlements, or will they choose to prioritise a sector that's been constrained like local government? I don't get a sense of what those priorities will be as things change. And I wonder if any of the witnesses have comments about how much we can realistically expect to enable democratic debate and scrutiny about the setting of those priorities and the deprioritisation that has to come with any priority, as opposed to just going back into the pattern of receiving each year's budget and reacting to it.
So that, please let me know. In the meantime, I'm going to ask a question of Tiffany. In terms of asset disposals, colleges will be permitted to retain 70% of the sale proceeds of more than £1 million. Why is it 70%, not 60%, not 80%, not 100%? What's the rationale behind that?
Yeah, thank you. So we were delighted to work with the college sector and the government to introduce this flexibility as part of a wide range of flexibilities we're exploring with the college sector as
Ms Ruff had highlighted, while borrowing in itself will not be a sole solution, is one of the flexibilities that we would like to explore with some of our college partners. The asset disposal goes hand in hand with College Infrastructure Investment Plan, which is, it's not simply about whether it's job cuts or selling assets. It's not asset stripping, I think was a phrase used earlier. It's about a strategic review of estates to make best use of the assets we have and plan ahead for what infrastructure is needed for the demand coming down the road. As for 70%, the idea is that you keep the first £1 million, you keep 70% of what's thereafter, and that remaining 30%, there's a debate to be had with the government around it, but could be put towards wider college sector initiatives. That could be, for example, looking at more shared services. We're working with the advanced procurement for universities and colleges around that. It could be looking at more collaborative forms of estate utilisation. We have some between schools and colleges and potentially between universities and colleges. Absolutely, I think colleges would prefer to keep all of it. However, I also think the college sector is very bought into this sector-wide collaborative approach. That's what the framework for future funding is looking at, and the College Infrastructure Investment Plan is looking at. The operating in silos may protect one individual institution's financial sustainability in the near term, but is not going to help with the long-term trajectory sustainability of the whole sector. And new forms of partnership working, we're seeing these emerging quite strongly just now. So I think they do recognise that this is part of that collaborative piece.
You've said in your submission that to secure efficiencies across the sectors we fund, we provide funding for the delivery of procurement services and digital infrastructure at a national level through advanced procurement for universities and colleges. So you've said that that there's been significant savings in that. So I'm just wondering if you can talk about how that's working and how it's managed to save resource and indeed the amount of capital you're able to deploy.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two leading pieces of shared services that we're very pleased to support. The first one is the advanced procurement for universities and colleges, and that means that they make huge savings when they go out to secure contracts across the wider sector. And we have a number of large institutions, some very large. We have a number of very small ones, and they would not achieve these savings as individual bodies. I think we estimate those as something around 27 million. Yeah,
27 and 37.2 million respectively.
Exactly. Yeah. And JISC is the digital infrastructure, and that ensures that, particularly with universities, that they have a shared service there and IT systems that, again, we have some huge universities. There are smaller ones where they themselves would not be able to achieve the quality.
Sorry, and is the Scottish Spending Review helping you to actually enable this? Because you can do contracts over a longer period of time, for example, or is this completely superfluous to the Scottish Spending Review? Because one of the things we're trying to look at here is how impactful the Scottish Spending Review is and how helpful it is and how it could be improved.
So I think the budget uplift for 26-27 means that we're working more with APUC, the Shared Service Procurement Team, to explore greater shared services across colleges, and where there could be catalysts for much bigger potential programmes there. So that has helped. The multi-year spending review, it is helpful to have that top-level direction of travel, but it doesn't have the level of detail where we would be able to make multi-year commitments in the way we'd quite like to. And I think, as we discussed, the scale of transformation and shared services we need will require multi-year investment, and I'm afraid level 2 presents some challenges for us.
Okay, thank you for that. Craig?
Sorry, it was just a question. We found out last week that the Scottish Government, I'll use flagship in an understated way, Invest to Save scheme in the present financial year had only really managed to spend 12 million of the 30 million allocated for it. I just wanted to get an impression from those around the table as to whether or not this kind of scheme is the mechanism, the catalyst to deliver efficiency, and whether or not your organisation's engaged with it. Because the impression I'm getting is that if this is indicative of the level of appetite for efficiency within government, it seems to be relatively muted. And I just wonder whether or not your own organisation's engaged with the Scottish Government scheme.
Does anyone wish to respond to that? Yes, Tiffany?
Yeah, happy to. So we are very much engaged in that, and we would be, if there's a scheme in 26-27, we'll certainly be bidding into it. I think the idea is very strong, as we mentioned on the TEP bill reform. It's upfront costs, but for long-term strategic change and benefits. So I think it's the right approach. I think it's part of a more strategic, multi-year approach to investment. I do think it would be helpful to discuss with government the time frame over which they're looking for the benefits to be realised. I think there was a reasonably short time frame the last time we looked at the scheme, and that is challenging. Where 2 to 3 year horizon is perhaps more realistic.
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues I think in terms of this Scottish spending reviews, of course, is that over the next 3 years, the kind of differential between who is gaining and who's losing is quite incredible. So housing, for example, has got a 26% increase in budget in real terms, whereas climate action and energy is declining by about 20%. So there's a kind of fan, if you like, because the overall resource is only increasing very modestly. COSLA, for example, sought additional resources which were equivalent to the entire, real terms uplift of the Scottish budget this year, which meant nothing extra for anybody else. So clearly that was never going to happen. But there's a real issue about the amount of demand relative to the kind of way in which resources and indeed capital are allocated. And I think one of the issues as well is that everyone is keen to say where additional funding should go, but I don't think anyone around the table would be willing to say publicly where they think those additional resources should come from. Although I'm quite happy if someone is. Yes, Tiffany.
Yeah, well, my only reflection would be, and it comes back to sort of Mr. Harvey's question earlier about how do you prioritise. I think there is a limit to which you can choose between, for example, health, local government, the police force and education. The truth may be that the prevention strategy, I think, is the idea, to invest upstream in, dare I say, education, skills, but economic growth, the enterprise agencies and similar. I think to stimulate inclusive growth and growth that supports just transition, net zero and addresses child poverty might mean that we can achieve improved financial fiscal sustainability and not the sorts of cuts and salami slicing that may not achieve true value.
Yeah, I think that goes on to issues like widening the tax base, etc., where we set taxes at, etc. But of course, economic growth, if we had economic growth to the level we had before the financial crash, I think we'd all be significantly better off. I think all studies have shown that, possibly by up to 30% better off per capita, incredibly, just by having those extra 1 or 2% over that 17-18 year period. Mirren.
Yeah, I agree with kind of those comments, and I think one of the questions in terms of the prioritisation and critically the deprioritisation, that's what we need to focus on, because there's lots of things that we're all doing that have come from legislation, some of them literally decades and decades old, that we're still caught in doing. And what happens is more legislation is added and nothing's taken away, and the budgets just get compressed and you can't continue to deliver. So there's a bit about that. What's the expectation on public services as well, which needs to go hand in hand in what are you then asking people to contribute, and how do you stimulate that? And I think that's the really critical kind of prioritisation, deprioritisation question.
Yeah, falling into desuetude, used to call it. I think there was something, maybe apocryphal, whereby in the 1990s it was still legal to kill someone with an arrow under a statue of Henry VIII, providing it was in Nottingham, some ludicrous thing like that. I don't know if there's any case, but I think there is an issue there, and I think it goes back again to an extent to zero-based budgeting. Prevention is an issue this committee's tackled. John's been a real terrier in terms of that particular issue over many years, but it's all about, it's easy to say we should spend money on prevention or this and that, but what do we deprioritise? And that's always been a real issue. And even in the 11 to 16 Parliament, when Mr Swinney allocated £500 million specifically for that, it didn't have the commensurate reduction in perhaps some of the services that were not delivering as much as possible. I remember Birmingham City Council came to us and they said they had to tell social workers who'd been working for us for 30 or 40 years that most of what you've done in your entire career has actually actually been completely worthless and might even be counterproductive. And it's quite hard to get people to buy into a new way of working. So it's not an easy task, but it's something that we on a committee are still keen to pursue. Now, everyone who we've now been engaged for an hour and a half. I hope folk are not too exhausted. So that's the kind of limit we set ourselves. But I'm keen, because there's no one else who's put their name down to make any comment, that we all have a wind-up where everyone has an opportunity to say something that may not have come up in the discussion, but they feel should be said. So I'm going to ask our 4 guests if they'd like to do any, make any final statements. The last person will be Mirren, because you spoke first. So I went to you first. So if any of our other 3 guests would like to make their final comment. Jack.
Yeah, I guess just to thank for the opportunity to be here. I think one of the questions that was shared and one of the focuses was what information would be useful to gather in future spending reviews when they come around. And just to go back to the reform journey that we're starting on, that will materially change the profile of our spend and what that looks like and how that splits between community and acute services. And I think that a future spending review needs to be recognisant of that. But when that arrives, we will work with colleagues to make sure that that happens.
Okay, thank you. Sarah?
Absolutely. And just that I'd like to reiterate that Police Scotland is absolutely supportive of government's ambition to deliver more effectively and efficiently for Scotland. However, I think for Police Scotland, we have to absolutely recognise what's come before and where we are, what we've delivered to date, and the ability to deliver further within the restricted funding envelope. For me.
Okay, thank you for that. Tiffany?
Yeah, thank you. Again, just thank you for the opportunity to discuss today. I agree with the scale of problems we're facing, and I do think we have an opportunity to support both stabilisation and transformation. I am going to say it because I've been dying to, that on zero-based budgeting, I do think there is something about a radical review of roles and responsibilities, almost putting finance to one side, that could be beneficial and I think is helpful in respect to the TEP bill, and delighted to support that however we can.
Okay, thank you very much. And Tiffany, last word is with you. Sorry, Mirren. You are Tiffany. Mirren, apologies.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone else has said, and similarly, local government's been on kind of the efficiency journey for decades, and the challenge there of where it goes. And I think that radical review of what we're all delivering and what Scotland wants us to deliver is where we need to be having sort of the conversations and shifting towards. So.
I remember debating best value a quarter of a century ago, for example, in this place. Okay, well, thank you very much to our guests and indeed from committee members for all the contributions today. I think that's been very helpful. A lot of what you have raised will be put to the Cabinet Secretary when she gives evidence to the committee. So that ends our deliberations and discussions for today. So I'm now going to call the committee meeting to an end. So thanks very much. Thanks all.